September 7th, 2019, 6 a.m. Bateman's Bay, New South Wales. The sun rises over what locals call Paradise, a coastal town where families have vacationed for generations, where retirees have built their dream homes overlooking the Tasman Sea. Children are getting ready for the last weeks of the school term. Holidaymakers are planning their Christmas getaways to the pristine beaches and eucalyptus forests that stretch inland from the coast. The morning air carries the familiar scent of salt and bush, the smell of an Australian summer beginning. What none of them know is that 200 kilometers inland, something is stirring in the drought-stricken forests that will transform their summer into a global catastrophe. By New Year's Eve, Bateman's Bay will be cut off from the world, its residents trapped on beaches as walls of flame consume everything around them. The fires that begin today will burn an area larger than England, kill over 1 billion animals, and send smoke around the globe in what scientists will call the worst wildlife disaster in modern history. The 2019-20 Australian bushfire season, later known as Black Summer, began not with a single spark, but with a perfect storm of conditions that had been building for months. Australia had just endured its driest year on record, with rainfall 40% below the long-term average. The country had also experienced its hottest year ever recorded, with temperatures running consistently above historical norms. But it was the weather pattern that developed in late 2019 that transformed these dry conditions into a continental disaster. A massive high-pressure system settled over southeastern Australia, creating what meteorologists call a blocking pattern, a stationary weather system that prevents rain-bearing clouds from reaching the continent. Under this dome of hot, dry air, temperatures soared to unprecedented levels while humidity dropped to single digits across vast areas of forest and grassland. The first major fire of the season erupted on September 7th in the Gospers Mountain area, northwest of Sydney. Within days, it had consumed 10,000 hectares. By October, it had burned 100,000 hectares. Local fire crews, among the most experienced in the world, attacked the flames with everything they had. But this fire was different. It was burning with an intensity and persistence that veteran firefighters had never encountered before. What made the Black Summer fires so dangerous wasn't just their size, it was their behavior. These weren't the typical bushfires that Australia had learned to live with over centuries. These were megafires, burning so hot and fast that they created their own weather systems, generating fire tornadoes and pyrocumulonimbus clouds that could hurl burning embers 40 kilometers ahead of the main fire front. By November, fires were burning across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia. The Australian government raised the national emergency response level and began calling for international assistance. But even as fire managers coordinated the largest firefighting effort in Australian history, they were beginning to realize that this season would exceed anything in human experience. The human drama began unfolding in communities across southeastern Australia. In the small town of Cobargo, New South Wales, population 800, residents had always lived with the threat of bushfire. It was part of life in rural Australia, the price paid for living among some of the most beautiful and fire-prone landscapes on Earth. But on December 31st, 2019, as the Baja forest fire approached their town, something was different. Robert Solway, a local dairy farmer, had lived in Cobargo for 30 years. He had seen fire seasons come and go, had fought fires as a volunteer with the Rural Fire Service, and knew the signs of approaching danger. But on the morning of New Year's Eve, when he stepped outside his farmhouse, the air itself seemed to be burning. The temperature was already 40 degrees Celsius at 9 a.m., with humidity so low that his skin felt like parchment. The wind was gusting from the west, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and something else, the metallic scent of superheated air that veteran firefighters recognize as the signature of an approaching firestorm. By noon, the sky had turned an ominous orange-black, and ash was falling like snow. Robert made the decision to evacuate his family, loading his wife and 2 young children into their car, along with whatever belongings they could carry. As they drove toward the coast, he looked back to see a wall of flame 100 meters high bearing down on their property. What Robert and thousands of other residents didn't know was that they were witnessing the beginning of a global environmental crisis. The smoke from the Australian fires wasn't just affecting local communities, it was being carried by high-altitude winds across the Pacific Ocean. creating air quality emergencies in cities on the other side of the world. By January 1st, 2020, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. More than 200 fires were burning across Australia, with 60 of them classified as out of control. The total area burned had already exceeded 5 million hectares, larger than the entire country of Costa Rica, and the fire season was reaching its peak. The fires were creating their own weather patterns, generating massive pyrocumuli and nimbus clouds that rose 16 kilometers into the atmosphere. These towering columns of smoke and ash were being caught by the jet stream and carried eastward across the Pacific. Satellite images showed ribbons of smoke stretching from Australia to South America, creating a pollution highway that spanned half the globe. In Santiago, Chile, 11,000 kilometers from the nearest major fire, residents woke up on January 8th to skies hazed with Australian smoke. The city's air quality monitors detected particulate matter that had traveled across the Pacific Ocean, carried by winds that had lifted the smoke high into the stratosphere before depositing it on the other side of the world. But it was the wildlife impact that truly revealed the unprecedented scale of the disaster. Professor Chris Dickman from the University of Sydney estimated that over 1 billion animals had been killed in the fires, a number so large it was difficult to comprehend. This wasn't just a count of individual deaths, but the collapse of entire ecosystems that had evolved over millions of years. On Kangaroo Island, off the coast of South Australia, the fires consumed 210,000 hectares, more than half the island's total area. The island had been home to unique populations of native animals, including an estimated 50,000 koalas. When the fires swept across the island in early January, an estimated 25,000 koalas perished. Half the island's population wiped out in a matter of days. The human stories emerging from the disaster were equally devastating. In the town of Malakuta, Victoria, 4,000 residents and tourists found themselves trapped on the beach as fires surrounded the community on New Year's Eve. The only escape route, the Prince's Highway, was cut by flames, leaving the entire population stranded with no way out. For 6 hours, families huddled on the sand as the sky turned black and embers rained down around them. The air was so thick with smoke that visibility dropped to just a few meters. Children cried as their parents tried to shield them from the falling ash. Elderly residents struggled to breathe in the toxic air. The evacuation of Malakuta became one of the largest maritime rescues in Australian history. Navy ships and civilian vessels worked for days to ferry residents to safety, but the images of families trapped on the beach became a symbol of Australia's vulnerability to extreme fire weather. The economic impact was staggering. The tourism industry, worth billions of dollars to regional communities, collapsed as visitors canceled trips to avoid the fires and smoke. Agricultural operations across the country were devastated, with livestock killed and crops destroyed. The wine industry in South Australia suffered massive losses as fires swept through some of the country's most prestigious wine regions. But it was the health impact that revealed the global reach of the disaster. A study published in the Medical Journal of Australia found that smoke from the Black Summer fires was responsible for 417 excess deaths across the country. The tiny particles in wildfire smoke, known as PM 2.5, penetrated deep into the lungs and entered the bloodstream, causing heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory failure. The victims weren't just in rural areas directly threatened by flames. In Sydney, 300 kilometers from the nearest major fire, hospitals reported a 30% increase in emergency room visits for respiratory problems. The city's air quality index, which normally ranges from 0 to 100, spiked to over 500, levels considered hazardous to human health. 7-year-old Zoe Simmons was among the youngest victims. Living in Canberra with her parents, Zoe had mild asthma but was generally healthy and active. On January 1st, 2020, she was playing in her backyard when the smoke from fires 100 kilometers away began to thicken over the capital. That evening, Zoe began coughing uncontrollably. Her parents followed all the protocols: emergency inhaler, steroid medication, keeping her indoors with air conditioning running, but nothing worked. As they rushed to Canberra Hospital, Zoe told her mother, "I can't breathe properly." She died 3 days later from complications related to smoke inhalation, becoming one of the youngest documented victims of the Black Summer fires. The international response to the crisis was unprecedented. The The United States sent firefighting aircraft and personnel. Canada deployed water bombers. New Zealand sent firefighters and equipment. For the first time, the global nature of the wildfire threat was being met with a truly international response. But even with international help, the fires continued to burn. By the end of January, more than 18 million hectares had burned, an area larger than England and Wales combined. The smoke was so thick in some regions that it was visible from space, creating massive plumes that stretched across entire states. The fires were also releasing unprecedented amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Scientists estimated that the Black Summer fires emitted 715 million tons of carbon dioxide, more than Australia's total annual emissions from all other sources combined. This was equivalent to adding an extra year's worth of the country's greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere in just a few months. The environmental impact extended far beyond carbon emissions. Entire ecosystems that had evolved over millions of years were being destroyed in a matter of weeks. The fires burned through 80% of the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, destroying ancient forests that had survived ice ages and previous fire cycles. The cultural impact was equally devastating. For Aboriginal communities across Australia, the fires were destroying sacred sites, traditional hunting and gathering areas, and landscapes that held 65,000 years of cultural significance. The knowledge systems that had been passed down through countless generations, understanding of seasonal patterns, wildlife behavior, and traditional fire management practices, were being disrupted by changes happening faster than communities could adapt. As autumn arrived and cooler temperatures finally began to slow the fires, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. The 2019-20 Australian bushfire season had burned more than 18.6 million hectares, destroyed over 5,900 buildings, and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. It had created air quality emergencies across multiple continents and fundamentally changed how the world thought about wildfire as a global threat. The economic cost was estimated at more than $100 billion in direct and indirect damages. But the true cost, including health impacts, lost biodiversity, and environmental damage, was incalculable. Insurance companies faced billions in claims, while governments at all levels struggled to fund recovery efforts and prepare for future fire seasons that scientists warned would likely be even worse. The Black Summer fires also revealed critical gaps in Australia's approach to fire management. Despite having some of the world's most experienced firefighters and sophisticated fire management systems, the country's resources were overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the blazes. Traditional fire management practices, including indigenous cultural burning, had been marginalized in favor of suppression-focused approaches that proved inadequate for extreme fire weather. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that the Black Summer might not be an anomaly, but a preview of the new normal. Climate scientists had been warning for years that rising temperatures and changing rainfall patterns would make extreme fire seasons more common. The Black Summer fires provided a devastating confirmation of those predictions. The disaster also highlighted the interconnected nature of global environmental systems. Smoke from fires in Australia affected air quality in South America. The loss of Australian forests reduced the planet's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. The destruction of unique ecosystems represented a loss for global biodiversity that could never be recovered. Today, as Australia continues to recover from Black Summer, the lessons learned are being incorporated into new approaches to fire management. Indigenous fire management practices are being revived and integrated with modern firefighting techniques. Building codes are being updated to make structures more fire-resistant. Early warning systems are being improved to provide better advance notice of extreme fire weather. But the most important lesson of Black Summer may be the recognition that wildfires are no longer just a local or even national problem. In an interconnected world where smoke can travel across oceans and affect the health of people on distant continents, wildfire management must become a global priority. The official death toll from the Black Summer bushfires stands at 34 people directly killed by the fires, with an additional 417 deaths attributed to smoke exposure. But the true human cost extends far beyond these numbers. There are the families torn apart by the disaster, the children traumatized by losing their homes and communities, the elderly who never recovered from the shock of seeing their world burn. For the families of victims like Zoe Simmons, the statistics provide little comfort. But their stories serve as a reminder that behind every number is a human life affected by a disaster that began in the forests of Australia and reached around the world. The Black Summer fires didn't just burn trees, they revealed the deadly interconnectedness of our global environment and the urgent need for international cooperation in addressing the climate crisis that makes such disasters increasingly likely. If you're concerned about wildfire smoke in your area, consider supporting organizations that monitor air quality and provide resources for vulnerable communities. And if you want to learn more about how climate change is affecting wildfire patterns and what can be done to address this growing threat, there are research institutions and advocacy groups working on solutions that deserve our attention and support. The smoke from the Black Summer fires has long since cleared from the skies over Santiago and Buenos Aires and Auckland, but the lessons of that terrible summer remain in the air we breathe, a reminder that in our interconnected world, a fire that starts in one forest can affect the health and safety of people on every continent. The Black Summer was Australia's disaster, but its impacts were felt around the globe, a preview of the challenges we all face in a world where extreme weather knows no borders.